is okay. So it is 4:20. So we shall start. So the topic of today's lecture is cellular adaptations, pigment disorders, and calcification. You just had your lecture on cellular adaptations and cell injury, I believe. So this is the second part of the same chapter. So I shall start now. In case any of you has any doubts or any questions, you can type in your question box, and I shall take all the questions at the end of the lecture. Okay, you can type all the questions and I shall take and answer all of your queries at the end of the lecture. So let's start. So what is cellular adaptation? Cellular adaptations are reversible changes in the number, size, phenotype, metabolic activity, or functions of cells in response to any stress. So whenever there is a change in the environment surrounding the cells adapt themselves to cope up with the stress. It can be physiological or pathological. In pathological adaptation, the cells try to modulate their structure and function in order to escape injury. For example, we'll see in subsequent slides. For example, in smokers, the normal respiratory epithelium, which is columnar ciliated, undergoes metaplasia to squamous epithelium. So there are 5 ways in which most of the cells adapt themselves to stress. So we'll discuss each one of them. They are hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, metaplasia, and dysplasia. Now, what is hypertrophy? Hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the individual cell, resulting in increase in the overall size of the organ. So there are no new cells, just that the existing cells, they become bigger due to increased amount of synthesis of the increased structural proteins and organelles. Hypertrophy occurs in situations when the cells, they have a limited capacity to divide. It can either be physiological or pathological, and it is usually caused by increased functional demand of an organ or by growth factor or hormonal stimulation. Okay. Now, the classical example of physiological hypertrophy, which all of you must have read in your first year, is the physiological massive enlargement of the uterus during pregnancy due to the effect of hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So, under the hormonal effect, there is marked smooth muscle hypertrophy. But along with hypertrophy, there is also smooth muscle hyperplasia. Hypertrophy is when the cell increases in the size, and hyperplasia is when the cells divide and they increase in the number. So during pregnancy, there is both hypertrophy and hyperplasia. As you can see, this photograph I have taken from Robbins. So this is a massively enlarged uterus in pregnancy. So this is a gravid uterus as compared to this is the normal uterus in a normal female, and this is the pregnant uterus. And you can see there is so much of these are the normal smooth muscle cells in the uterus, and these are the so much enlarged and plump smooth muscle cells which have abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm, and they have become enlarged and they have plump to oval nuclei. Now this was the example of smooth muscle. Also, another example you see in weightlifters and athletes, where the striated muscles in both skeletal muscle as well as in the heart, in the cardiac muscle, they undergo hypertrophy in response to the increased workload. Now, coming on to pathological hypertrophy, a classical example is we see in the myocardium when it is subjected to persistently increased workload. For example, in hypertensive patients or in patients who have a stenotic aortic valve, there is massive hypertrophy of the left ventricle. So basically 2 types of signals are implicated in this pathological hypertrophy. One is the mechanical trigger, that is a stretch. The more the ventricle is stretched, the more it undergoes hypertrophy. And the second is the soluble mediators, which stimulate cell growth. Now, what are these mediators? They are basically growth factors and adrenergic hormones which turn on certain signal transduction pathways. You must have read in your biochemistry, all these factors, they basically induce signal transduction pathways and which leads to induction of certain genes which lead to increased synthesis of many cellular proteins, including the structural proteins, more synthesis of proteins, myofilaments. So all of these basically lead to increase in the cell size, and it increases the force which is generated with each contraction. Also, apart from increase in the quantity of these proteins, there is also change in the type of contractile proteins. So when if required, if there is any demand to meet the functional demand, there is switch of the contractile proteins from the adult type to the fetal type. This is particularly seen in cases of muscle hypertrophy, where alpha myosin heavy chain, which is the adult type, it is replaced by the fetal beta form of myosin heavy chain. So this is also an example which is seen in the pathological form of hypertrophy. So this is a photograph which is which again I have taken from Robbins. It shows the you can make out this is the left, this is the right ventricle, and this this ventricle with a thick ventricular wall, which is more than 1.5 centimeter. It is the thickened left ventricular wall. So there is marked left ventricular hypertrophy, which is pathological, which is abnormal, and it is a case of, it is a gross specimen from the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is leading to marked left ventricular hypertrophy. Now coming on to hyperplasia, as I told you, hyperplasia is an increase in the number of cells in an organ that usually results from increased proliferation of more or less differentiated cells. It occurs only in the organs in which the cells are still capable of replication. So it usually occurs concurrently with hypertrophy, as I told you, in pregnancy, because most often the stimulus is the same, both for hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Now under the, it is again either physiological or pathological. The classical example of physiological hyperplasia is the hyperplasia of the glandular epithelium of female breast at puberty or in pregnancy, which is again under the influence of certain hormones. Smooth muscle hyperplasia in gravid uterus, and regeneration of normal endometrium after shedding, after the completion of normal menstrual cycle. Again the and normal endometrium, it undergoes proliferation and hyperplasia. That is another example. And then is wound healing, which we'll be discussing in the subsequent lectures, in which whenever there is an injury or skin abrasion, so the gap of the wound is filled by the formation of a granulation tissue, which is nothing but the an active proliferation of fibroblastic cells and the endothelial cells. So that these are the examples of physiological hyperplasia. Now it can also be compensatory hyperplasia when the hyperplasia occurs following removal of a part of an organ or a contralateral organ in a paired organ. For example, whenever there is partial hepatectomy, there is release of growth factors which are produced by the surrounding or by the uninjured hepatocytes, which lead to proliferation of the hepatocytes, and it leads to restoration of the liver size. Also, there is, as we all know, there is regeneration of the epidermis after any kind of injury or skin abrasion. Since you know that kidney is a paired organ, so following nephrectomy of a single on one side, there is compensatory hyperplasia of the nephrons, of the existing nephrons of the other, of the contralateral kidney. So these are the classic examples of compensatory hyperplasia. Now the third is the pathological hyperplasia, which is caused by excessive hormonal or growth factor stimulation. The classic example is benign prostatic hyperplasia seen in the old age in men, which occurs in response to the androgenic stimulation. Also, disturbance in the hormonal balance in females, in the perimenopausal females, often leads to increased estrogenic stimulation, leading to endometrial hyperplasia. which leads to abnormal menstrual bleeding in perimenopausal age group. Then there are certain hyperplastic conditions in which there is a role of viral infections. For example, the papilloma virus. This group of viruses, they have a predilection to infect skin and mucosal regions. So they lead to massive hyperplasia of the stratified squamous epithelium, leading to warts. So that is, the warts are classically associated with papilloma virus. It is believed that the virus, the viral genes itself lead to secretion of certain growth factors, or it induces the infected host cells to secrete certain growth factors which are implicated in the hyperplasia of the epithelium. Now, it is important to understand what is the basic difference between a pathological hyperplasia and a cancer. So when the growth control mechanisms, they become ineffective or they become permanently dysregulated, that is when the hyperplasia is converted into a cancer. So cancer is nothing but simply an unregulated hyperplasia. So hyperplasia is always under the control, under the check of a normal regulatory mechanisms. But when these control mechanisms become ineffective or dysfunctional, then the hyperplasia can progress to malignancy. So that is why hyperplasia always constitutes a fertile soil in which eventually the cancers or carcinomas may arise. Now coming on to the next adaptation, that is atrophy. Atrophy, as the name suggests, is acquired reduction of cell size, meaning loss of cell substance or number of parenchymal cells in an organ. When sufficient number of the cells undergo atrophy in an organ, then automatically the entire tissue or the organ is reduced in size. So these atrophic cells, they have a diminished function, but they are not dead. So basically this adaptation is achieved by the cells to basically achieve a new equilibrium so that the cells can survive in response to the reduced blood supply, nutrition, or whatever is the reduced stimulation factors. Now there are various types of atrophy. The physiological atrophy is also the basically senile atrophy, which is normally seen with aging. It is usually due to loss of endocrine stimulation as we age. For the classic examples are atrophy of the lymphoid tissue in the lymph nodes, appendix, thymus. So that all these organs are atrophied with age. Also, there is atrophy of the gonads after menopause due to loss of endocrine stimulation, and atrophy of brain with the aging. Now, other examples. Now, atrophy can be of various types, like the starvation atrophy, which is basically due to inadequate nutrition. Ischemic atrophy, whenever there is diminished blood supply, the organs or the cells, they undergo ischemia and they undergo atrophy. Decreased workload can lead to disuse atrophy. This is classically seen in patients who have fracture and who are on prolonged immobilization. So they basically, prolonged immobilization leads to disuse and it leads to atrophy of the leg muscles and of the calf muscles. Loss of nerve supply, innervation, for example, in patients of spinal cord injuries, leads to neuropathic atrophy. Loss of endocrine stimulation, as we see in old age, so leads to endocrine atrophy. Then there can be pressure atrophy due to pressure and idiopathic atrophy. They are the rarer forms. So how does atrophy basically results? It is basically a combination of decreased protein synthesis because of reduced metabolic activity, because of reduced requirement, and increased degradation of the cellular proteins. Now, how is this increased degradation carried out? It is basically carried out by the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, which is the main enzyme system. And whenever there is nutrient deficiency or disuse, so it activates this ubiquitin proteasome pathway and it causes degradation of the intracellular proteins. It is this activation is commonly seen in the catabolic conditions like cachexia, which is associated with cancer. Now coming on to metaplasia, which is a very important adaptive response of the cells to stress. Now, how do you define metaplasia? It is a change. It is usually a reversible change in which one adult cell type is replaced by another cell type. Now, the cell type which is particularly sensitive to a particular stress is replaced by the another cell type which is more resistant, which is better equipped to withstand those adverse environmental conditions. As I told you, it is usually reversible if the stimulus is withdrawn. Now, the cause of metaplasia is usually changes in the surrounding environment or any kind of chronic irritation, chronic inflammation, or some kind of nutritional deficiency. Now, basically, there are two types of metaplasia. The first is the epithelial metaplasia, which is the most common one. And in epithelial metaplasia, the classic example is the squamous metaplasia. As you recall from your, just hold on, someone has asked me a question. Just hold on. I think I cannot see any question right now. I'll take all the questions at the end of the session. You keep on typing, okay? Yes. So yes. So squamous metaplasia, as you have read from your first year, what is the type of epithelium? Which is what is the type of lining epithelium in the bronchus and in the upper respiratory tract? Can anyone tell? You can type in your chat box. So the type of epithelium which you see in the upper respiratory tract is always columnar ciliated. Okay, it is pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Correct. Very correct. So pseudostratified columnar epithelium is the usual lining in the upper respiratory tract. Now what happens in chronic smokers? There is a metaplasia, there is a change in this lining epithelium to the squamous epithelium, which is believed to be more resistant to the obnoxious chemicals present in the cigarette smoke. Same happens for endocervix. Endocervical lining, if you remember, is a simple columnar lining which is filled with mucus, which is mucin filled columnar epithelium. Now, whenever there is chronic inflammation, in females, if chronic inflammation, chronic cervicitis, so that inflammation irritates the epithelium so much that it undergoes metaplasia to the squamous lining. So there is squamous metaplasia. In same way, the squamous metaplasia occurs in the urinary tract. So as you remember, the epithelium of the renal pelvis and of the ureters is by the transitional epithelium. There also, if there is any irritation by stone or any parasitic inflammation, any infection, chronic inflammation that irritates the transitional epithelium and it undergoes metaplasia to squamous line. So that is one classical example of squamous metaplasia. And also another important reason is vitamin A deficiency. If you recall, vitamin A is essential for epithelial differentiation. So whenever there is a vitamin A deficiency, it will lead to squamous metaplasia in the upper respiratory tract. Now the other type of epithelial this I have already told you, this is the normal ciliated columnar epithelium of the respiratory tract, and it undergoes metaplasia into the squamous lining. Now how this one cell type changes suddenly to the squamous cells? It is believed that these basal cells are the basically progenitor cells. They have the potential to differentiate into any kind of epithelium. So these basal resting cells, they can differentiate into ciliated columnar also, and they can differentiate into the stratified squamous epithelium also. So these are the basal cells which have the potential to differentiate, and they take an initiative towards the metaplasia, and it is believed to be more resistant to the chemicals. Now another classical example is columnar metaplasia, in which it is reverse of the squamous metaplasia, and this is the only example in the body in which there is columnar metaplasia, that is in patients of chronic gastric reflux. As you are aware that the lower end of the esophagus, the whole of the esophagus is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. Now in patients who have chronic gastritis and gastric acid reflux, so that acid is that irritates the stratified squamous epithelium and it undergoes metaplasia into the gastric or intestinal type of columnar epithelium. So as you know, stomach epithelium, the columnar epithelium or the gastric epithelium is much more resistant to the acidic environment. So that is why it is believed to be more resistant to the acidic environment, and the lower end of esophagus undergoes metaplasia to gastric type of epithelium in patients of chronic gastric reflux. So, and when it undergoes intestinal type of metaplasia, then that is known as Barrett's esophagus. So that is the only example in the body where there is metaplasia from squamous to columnar. Otherwise, most of the places it is the squamous epithelium which is believed to be the most resistant one. But here the columnar epithelium is most resistant to the acidic environment. That is why it is the other ways around. Now, rarely it can be mesenchymal metaplasia. So that the classical example is osseous metaplasia, that is bone, formation of bone in the soft tissues, particularly in the foci of injury or inflammation, or cartilaginous metaplasia. So that is usually rare. Now, what is dysplasia? Dysplasia is something, it is defined as disordered cellular development. So this basically there is an increase in the number of cell layers. There is a disorderly arrangement of the cells from basal layer till the surface layer. So the arrangement of the cells becomes disordered, haphazard, and normally the cells, the nuclei are lying, they are all basal. They are closely lying close to the basement membrane, but there is loss of basal polarity in dysplasia, and there is lot of you will read about in much more detail about dysplasia in the next chapter, but I'll just show you here. So this is the normal epithelium. You can make out. These are the nicely. Can you make out the nuclei are lying in a single row, and they are so closely lying close to the basement membrane. And these are the superficial layers, and the cells keep on maturing as they move towards the top. Now this is a dysplastic epithelium. Now look at the nuclei. First of all, there is so much of haphazard. There is so much of disordered arrangement of the cells. There is loss of basal polarity. The nuclei, individual nuclei are much more larger. They are enlarged. There is enlargement of the nuclear size, and there is loss of polarity, and there is hyperchromasia. See these nuclei and look at these nuclei. They are become more darker, and they are enlarged, and they are pleomorphism. Pleomorphism, they show pleomorphism means there is variation in the shape. Here all of the nuclei are same, small size, pycnotic nucleus. Here all of the nuclei are becoming large. They are darker, and their variation in size and shape. So that is why they are pleomorphism. So this is what do you mean by dysplasia. So they have pleomorphism, they have nucleocytoplasmic ratio, means the ratio of the nucleus to cytoplasm is increased. When the nucleus size is increased, so this ratio is increased. There is hyperchromasia, they are more darker staining, and they have increased mitosis. So dysplasia is basically a pre-malignant condition. It is a precursor of malignancy. So that is another adaptive response of cells to stress. Whenever there is a chronic inflammation or stress, the cells can undergo dysplasia. Now that finishes us with the cellular adaptations. So the next important topic for today is intracellular accumulations. Basically, accumulations means the cells, they often accumulate abnormal amount of various kind of substances. So they may be either transient accumulation or permanent accumulation, and that accumulation may be harmless to the cell, or it can induce varying degree of cell injury. And most of the intracellular accumulations are present within the cytoplasm, or sometimes within the specific organelles like lysosomes. Now we can classify the accumulations into three basic categories. First is the constituents of the normal cellular metabolism. They can be accumulated in the cell. For example, fats, proteins, carbohydrates, which are normally produced. They can undergo accumulation in the cell. Or there can be accumulation of abnormal substances which are produced due to abnormal cell metabolism. This is seen in certain kind of storage disorders or inborn errors of metabolism. Or there can be accumulation of certain exogenous or endogenous pigments. Now we'll deal one by one with the mechanism of intracellular accumulation. Now first is production of a normal endogenous substance which is normally produced at an increased rate, either at an increased rate or the rate of metabolism is inadequate to remove it. This is classically seen in fatty liver. For example, this is a hepatocyte. Now, because of abnormal metabolism, the fat is produced at an increased rate, and also the metabolism is also inadequate to remove it. So that is one mechanism. Second is, there is an abnormal endogenous substance. Because of some mutation, from the genetic mutation, the substance which is produced is either abnormal, or there is some defect in the protein folding or in the intracellular transport of the protein, or due to which it is not able to degrade. So those abnormal proteins are not able to undergo degradation, and then they are accumulated within the cell because the cell is not able to secrete them out. So that is a classical example which is seen in the case of alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So in which there is production of an abnormal protein which there is a defective protein folding and transport, and due to which the protein undergoes accumulation within the hepatocyte. Now third is, there is an accumulation of normal endogenous substance, but which undergoes accumulation because of deficiency in the enzymes which are required for metabolism of that particular substance. For example, various lysosomal glycogen storage disorders and lipid storage disorders, they come into this category in which this complex lipids and glycogens, they get accumulated because of the deficiency of certain enzymes which are required for the metabolism. And the last is any injection of phagocytosed indigestible pigments or material which the cell is not able to degrade or not able to metabolize. So those pigments, or which are usually exogenous, are accumulated within the cell, and the cell is not able to metabolize. So these are the main pathways as we have already discussed. Now the pigments are usually, they can be either exogenous, which are, which are basically enter outside the body, or there can be endogenous, in which they are produced within the body due to some abnormal metabolic pathway, and then they are deposited. Now we'll deal one by one. Now what is fatty change? Fatty change is also known as steatosis. It refers to accumulation of fats. What are fats? They are nothing but neutral triglycerides within the parenchymal cells. Most often, it is the classical example of fatty change is the liver, since liver is the major organ involved in the fat metabolism, but it can rarely also occur in the heart, skeletal muscle and kidney. Now, the most common cause of fatty liver is alcohol. Alcohol abuse and diabetes, which is associated with obesity. They are the most common causes of fatty liver, but it can also be seen in severe malnutrition, obesity, anorexia, and pregnancy, and certain drugs. Now, can you see this photograph? This micro photograph, this is the gross photograph of the, and you can identify the organ, it is liver. As you can see, the liver is enlarged. It is very much enlarged, and it is soft, and the margins are soft and they are curved margins. Normally the liver has very sharp margins. Because of fatty liver, because of fat accumulation, the capsule is bulging and shining, and the margins are all rounded up, and it is very heavy and enlarged liver, and on cut it is very soft and greasy. On cut it is very soft and greasy. That is a very characteristic of fatty liver. And if you see on microscopy, can you make out these empty looking round vacuoles which are present within the hepatocytes? If you can see these white, roundish, empty looking vacuoles, these are nothing but fat droplets. They are big fat droplets which are occupying whole of the cell, and they're pushing the nucleus to the periphery. So this is known as macrovesicular steatosis. Now steatosis can be of two types. It can be microvesicular or macrovesicular. Micro is when there are numerous small droplets, fine droplets, numerous multiple small droplets within a hepatocyte with a central nucleus. That is not very well appreciated in this photograph. Actually, if you see this cell, the numerous small droplets of fat with a central nucleus, that is microvesicular steatosis. And When these microvesiculars coalesce to form a single large droplet of fat which displaces the nucleus to the periphery, that is known as macrovesicular steatosis. This is a classical case of fatty liver. You will read this more in detail in the subsequent lectures. Now, another example is cholesterol and deposition of cholesterol esters. That is classically seen in atherosclerotic plaques or the atheromas. So, atheromas are basically seen in patients of atherosclerosis. What happens is that it is seen in the classically large arteries and aorta. In the intima, within the as you know, the vessels have three layers: intima, media, and adventitia. So the smooth muscle cells and the macrophages within the intimal layer of the large vessels, they are filled with foamy cells, and these foamy cells, they are filled with cholesterol and cholesterol esters, which gives a very yellowish appearance to these plaques. So that is known as, you can make out, this is the vessel lumen, this is the intima, this is the media, and this is adventitia. So there is accumulation of these macrophages and the smooth muscle cells which have intracytoplasmic cholesterol, and also there's a lot of extracellular deposition of cholesterol, and this whole thing, the yellowish appearance, this whole thing is known as atheroma. And this is another example of cholesterol deposition. This is a section from gallbladder. This is the gallbladder epithelium, and in the lamina, this is the epithelium, and in the lamina propria of the gallbladder, you can see this foamy macrophages with the fine vacuolated cytoplasm. These foamy macrophages, they have again engulfed cholesterol within them. So this is known as cholesterolosis, which is often seen in patients of chronic cholecystitis. So they are also laden with cholesterol. Then another entity is xanthomas, which is again a clustering of foamy cells in the subepithelium of the skin and in the tendons. That is seen in the patients of hyperlipidemia. So xanthomas are also collection of foamy cells filled with the cholesterol seen in patients of hyperlipidemia. This is another histological section from the atheroma. You can see this is the intima, and there is this collection of a lot of extracellular cholesterol. Can you see this needle shaped clefts? These are very classical cholesterol clefts which are needle shaped, and there is some calcification. It is undergoing some calcification, this atheroma, and there may be some chronic inflammatory cells and foamy histiocytes also surrounding this atheroma. So this all is a basically atherosclerotic plaque which is seen in a large vessel, probably a large artery. Now that was fats. Now protein accumulation intracellular can also occur when it occurs in basically three conditions. First, when excess amount of protein is presented to the cell which is exceeding its capacity to metabolize. Second, when there is excessive synthesis and secretion of the protein by the cell itself. Third, when there is defective intracellular transport and secretion of critical proteins. The classic example I gave you is alpha-1 antitrypsin, in which this in PiZZ genotype there is a defective protein folding which leads to intracellular aggregation of this alpha-1 antitrypsin within the hepatocytes. Now, if you know what is nephrotic syndrome is a disorder of heavy proteinuria in which there is more than 3.5 grams of protein is excreted out in per day. So, due to heavy protein leakage across the glomerular filtration membrane, the significantly increased amount of protein is reabsorbed by the tubular epithelial cells, by the proximal renal tubules, and that increased reabsorbed protein is visible as pink hyaline cytoplasmic droplets. See, this is the photograph. These are the proximal renal tubules, if you remember from your anatomy. And can you see this pink hyaline droplets of variable sizes within the cytoplasm of these cells? All these droplets which are of variable size, they are basically protein reabsorption granules which are classically seen in patients of nephrotic syndrome because of heavy proteinuria. Now, second example is stimulation of, I told you, excessive synthesis of proteins, for example, immunoglobulins, which are synthesized in the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that is seen in the neoplastic plasma cells. And these immunoglobulins, they form rounded eosinophilic Russell bodies. These are known as Russell bodies. If you can see, can you see these plasma cells? The plasma cells have always eccentrically placed nucleus with a characteristic cartwheel-like of chromatin. And can you see this pale pink eosinophilic inclusions? These are Russell bodies. Now, these are nothing but the proteins, immunoglobulins, which are secreted by the plasma cells, and they are visible and as the Russell bodies in the plasma cells. So another example is accumulation of cytoskeleton proteins. What are cytoskeleton proteins? Are various intermediate filaments like keratin filaments. So that can also be accumulated within the cells. For example, classical example is alcoholic Mallory hyaline. Mallory hyaline is a very characteristic example of intermediate filaments which is deposited within the hepatocytes. This you will read in further when you read systemic pathology. So that is characteristically seen in patients of alcoholic liver disease. Also, abnormal proteins like amyloidosis can be seen, which are also accumulated extracellularly. Now, rarely glycogen can also be accumulated within the cells. Now, glycogen appears as clear vacuoles, and how can we confirm that whether it is glycogen or it is fat? Glycogen stains positive for PAS, and it is sensitive to diastase. So, on PAS it will appear as magenta pink color, but if we apply diastase, it will wash out since it is sensitive to diastase. So, in patients of uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, glycogen can be seen deposited within the proximal tubules and within the cardiac myocytes and often within the hepatocytes also. So, in uncontrolled diabetes, there can be accumulation of glycogen within kidney, hepatocytes, cardiac myocytes. And also any metabolic disorders like glycogen storage disorders, glycogen accumulates within the hepatocytes, and that is a big group of disorders of glycogen storage disorders. In those we see glycogen accumulation. Now coming on to pigments. Pigments, what are pigments? Pigments means basically colored substances, some of which can be normal. They can be normal constituents of cells like melanin, or some can be abnormal and exogenous, and they accumulate only in certain special circumstances. Now, it can be exogenous or endogenous pigments. Endogenous means which are produced, which are within the synthesized within our body, like lipofuscin, melanin, and hemocyanin. They are very important. We are going to discuss them. And exogenous means which are acquired from the environment. So the most important is the carbon or the coal dust, and it leads to anthracosis and coal workers pneumoconiosis. And also rarely other heavy metals can be accumulated within the cells like silver, which leads to argyria, lead, and some other pigments inoculated during tattooing. Now, carbon or the coal dust is the most common air pollutant which is present in the air and in urban. It is a basically pollutant of urban life. So, it is basically inhaled, and whenever it is inhaled, it is picked up by the alveolar macrophages and it is transported through the lymphatics to the regional lymph nodes. So, and that leads to anthracosis. So, what is basically anthracosis? It is nothing, just the blackening of the tissues due to deposition of coal or the carbon. Coal basically is composed of the blackish carbon pigment. So as you can see, this is the gross photograph of the lung, in which can you see this focal black pigmentation which is scattered throughout the lungs. So that is anthracosis because of the focal deposition of the carbon in the lung. And this is the microscopic section from the same, in which you can see this blackish pigment which is present within the macrophages. So these are carbon laden macrophages which are present within a draining lymph node. So this is basically anthracosis. So it is accumulation of carbon laden macrophages. Now these are coal dust which is filled with the macrophages are filled with blackish coal dust, and they are located in the interstitium of the lung. interstitium of the lung, basically adjacent to the bronchioles. You can see this is a bronchiolar epithelium, this is a bronchiole. So it is ingested through the bronchioles and then it is deposited, taken up by the alveolar macrophages, and they are deposited around the bronchioles, around the vessels, and within the hilar lymph nodes. So they are drained, basically taken through the lymphatics to the hilar lymph nodes. So it is basically anthracosis of the lung parenchyma and of the hilar lymph nodes. Now what happens in the certain occupational diseases like in coal miners, the persons who work in coal mines, they are heavily exposed to the carbon dust. So in those patients, this carbon dust can induce a massive fibroblastic reaction in the lungs, that is known as coal workers pneumoconiosis. What is coal workers pneumoconiosis? That is an abnormal response, a fibroblastic response of the body, of the lung parenchyma in response to this pigment. So there is formation of macules, coal macules, which are nothing, just 1 to 2 millimeter in size, collection of this carbon pigment laden macrophages, and some larger nodules which are again composed of these pigment laden macrophages along with fibrosis. So there is a massive fibroblastic response and it is scattered throughout the lung, but more common in the upper lobe. So that basically is pathological because it impairs the respiratory capacity of the lung, and if it is progressive and if the exposure is still continuous, so it often progresses to massive fibrosis and it limits the respiratory capacity of the lung. Now, other exogenous, this carbon is the most common exogenous pigment which is very harmful, and it is commonly seen in all the individuals of who are staying in the urban cities. Other pigments which can also be harmful, like I told you, silica, plumbism is lead poisoning, and they can also cause discoloration, basically permanent grey discoloration of the skin and the conjunctiva. Now coming on to the endogenous pigments, the most important is lipofuscin. Now lipofuscin, the word is derived from the word fuscus, which means brown lipid. Now it is also known as lipochrome or wear and tear pigment or the aging pigment. Now it basically represents, what is lipochrome? It is nothing, just polymer of the lipids complexed with proteins. It is believed to be derived from the lipid peroxidation of polyunsaturated fats from the cellular membranes. Now this is very important. You can get a short note on any of these endogenous pigments. Lipofuscin is basically a telltale sign of free radical injury. So free radicals, they cause lipid peroxidation of the cellular membranes, and that generates this pigment. So presence of this pigment is not injurious to cell, and it is a very classically yellowish brown, finely granular pigment. And I'll show you the photographs. Can you make out? This is yellowish brown golden pigment, and it is a very classical perinuclear. This is a hepatocyte. This is a hepatocyte, and it has a perinuclear location, classical location, and around the nucleus within the hepatocytes, and it is a wear and tear pigment. So it is seen more commonly as with aging. So it is very commonly seen in patients in aging patients in the heart and liver. It is classically described in the heart and liver, and also in patients who have severe malnutrition or in cancer patients. And so much so that this brown pigment, when it is present in the large amounts in the cardiac myocytes, this is a section from the cardiac cells, cardiac myocytes. You can see this is a perinuclear golden brown granular pigment accumulation within the cardiac myocytes, and it leads to brown atrophy. It is known as brown atrophy of aging heart. So the heart becomes atrophied with aging. It becomes brown in color because of deposition of this lipofuscin granules. Also, this pigment can be rarely seen in adrenal cortex, CNS, testes and seminal vesicles, and it is positive for Zn staining. You will read about these stains later on over this your professional year. So Zn staining, Ziehl-Neelsen staining picks up this stain, and also Sudan black B are lipofusion pigment. Now another photograph, these are hepatocytes and they have beautiful perinuclear golden brown pigment within the hepatocytes, which is seen in aging. Now next pigment is melanin. Melanin, melas, the Greek word melas means black. So it is the endogenous, it is non-hemoglobin. It is not derived from hemoglobin. It is a non-hemoglobin dark brown to blackish pigment. It is found in skin, as we all know. Melanin is an important constituent of skin, eye and substantia nigra in the brain. It is, you must be aware from your biochemistry that it is synthesized from tyrosine. Tyrosinase acts on tyrosine and it forms dihydroxyphenylalanine, which forms dopaquinone, and then it leads to formation of melanin, and this process occurs within the melanosomes of melanocytes. So melanin is responsible basically for our skin coloration and it is protective against harmful UV radiations. Though only melanocytes, they produce the melanin, but the basal layer of the skin, this is the epidermis, the basal keratinocytes of the epidermis and some dendritic cells, they can store the melanin. So these are, you can see the melanin in the basal layer, but they are not melanocytes. We cannot see, they are not easily seen, but the basal keratinocytes are storing the melanin. So melanin, basically the significance is that any tumors, benign and malignant, any neoplasms of the melanocytic cells are they basically are contain melanin pigment. And how do we confirm this stain? This is a stain Masson-Fontana. Masson-Fontana is a stain which is used to identify melanin. Basically, the melanin it reduces the silver nitrate. So silver nitrate, as you know, is AgNO3. So silver nitrate, it is Ag plus. So melanin reduces silver nitrate to silver, which appears as black. So Ag plus goes to Ag and that appears as black deposit. So that is how Masson-Fontana is identified as melanin. And another stain, that is small stain. Small stain also stains melanin blue-green. And another is that melanin basically is bleached with strong oxidizing agents like potassium permanganate or hydrogen peroxide. So basically when a tumor which is heavily loaded with melanin and we need to see the cells, so you can see this is a basically this is epidermis and this is dermis, and this there is a tumor. Basically there is a there's a neoplastic proliferation of the melanocytes. How do we know these are melanocytes? Because they are all filled with blackish melanin pigment. So this is a intradermal. This is a intradermal. It is present only in the dermis. So it is a intradermal melanocytic nevus because it is filled with all blackish pigment. And this is a higher power view of the same. Can you see these cells? These are all melanocytes and they are filled, loaded with this pigment. Now if we want to study, we want to see this morphology of these cells, so we can bleach. We can bleach this melanin by the help of strong oxidizing agents like potassium permanganate or hydrogen peroxide. So that is another property of the melanin, that it undergoes bleach. So three stains, basically three methods to confirm melanin. One is the Masson-Fontana, second is the small stain, and third is undergoes bleaching by strong oxidizing agent. Now another pigment which is rarely seen is homogentisic acid. It is basically seen in alkaptonuria, which is a rare inborn metabolic disorder. And this pigment is deposited in the skin, connective tissue, and also in the cartilage, and gives a grayish appearance. And this it is the appearance, a grayish appearance, and it is known as ochronosis. Now coming on to hemosiderin. Hemosiderin is a very important pigment. It is hemoglobin derived. It is again golden yellow to brown in color. It is usually granular to crystalline pigment. And as you know, it basically comprises of iron. Now, how is iron transported in the body? It is transported in the form of transferrin. But within the cell, this iron is stored in association with apoferritin. So it forms basically, iron combines with apoferritin to form ferritin micelles. So whenever there is any excessive deposition of ferritin, whenever there is excessive ferritin, so it forms, it accumulates in the form of hemosiderin granules. So hemosiderin is nothing but it represents excessive aggregates of ferritin micelles. So normally small amount of hemosiderin is seen within the phagocytes of bone marrow, spleen and liver. Normally, because all these the phagocytes here are engaged in the RBC breakdown. So the senescent RBCs, they are taken up these macrophages which are present in these organs like bone marrow, spleen, and liver, and this is very important. So hemoglobin is basically degraded within the macrophages. Globin is separated, which is the protein part. Heme is separated. Now heme, out of heme, the iron is separated out from the heme, and it is stored as ferritin within the cell, or it is added to the proteins, or it is released for circulation in the form of transferrin. It binds to the transferrin and then it is transported wherever it is required. Or it undergoes storage in the form of ferritin or hemosiderin, or it is added to the proteins. And the rest of the part of the heme, it undergoes degradation to form bilirubin. So this is very important. Heme degradation pathway is very important. You must know, and you must have already read in your biochemistry. So hemosiderosis is a disorder in which there is accumulation of hemosiderin, which is more in macrophages. Now the characteristic of hemosiderosis is that it does not cause any tissue damage, because it is just accumulation of excessive hemosiderin in the macrophages. Now this is what happens in a common bruise. That is a classical example of a localized hemosiderosis. Now whenever there is an injury, there is bruise, there is extravasation of red cells at the site of injury. And then again the same process, they are taken up by the macrophages, the hemoglobin is break down, and after the removal of the iron, the heme moiety, basically the heme component, it is reduced basically to biliverdin, which is the green bile, and then it is reduced to bilirubin, which is the reddish bile. So iron, and which is released from the heme, is incorporated into ferritin. So this is hemosiderosis. Now the characteristic I told you, that it does not damage the parenchymal cells of any of the organs. So it does not impair organ function. It only accumulates in the phagocytes of the parenchymal organs. So it basically accumulates in all the organs, phagocytes, wherever the phagocytes are present, bone marrow, spleen, lymph node, liver, but it is not accumulated within the parenchymal cells. So it is classically it is seen in hemolytic anemias, when there is lot of RBC turnover, RBC damage is there, hemolytic anemias, repeated blood transfusions, or any abnormality in the iron absorption. So you can see this is a macrophages which are filled with this golden brown hemosiderin pigment. So they are basically accumulated because there is RBC breakdown. So there is RBC breakdown and the heme is released, and this hemosiderin pigment is engulfed by the macrophages, which will clear up this debris and it will be recycled. Now this is different from the hemochromatosis. Hemochromatosis is a genetic. It is a genetic inborn error of metabolism in which there is increased absorption of dietary iron. So there is excessive accumulation of hemosiderin, but it will be in the parenchymal organs and it will cause tissue damage. So mind it, this is important. Here the pigment is accumulated within the parenchymal cells of the liver, of the pancreas, and it will cause tissue damage and it will lead to organ dysfunction. So these patients, they often present with, they are deposited within the pancreas and islets of Langerhans. So the patients develop diabetes, and they are present with cardiomyopathies, and they have hormonal disturbances because the pigment is deposited within all the endocrine organs like pituitary, adrenal, and thyroid. And classically, they are present within the hepatocytes, and it leads to micronodular cirrhosis. So the patients present with cirrhosis, basically signs of liver failure, cardiomyopathy, and diabetes, which leads to, and also these patients have skin discoloration. So they're very characteristic grayish discoloration of the skin, and which is known as bronzed diabetes. So this is the very classical presentation of the patients of hemochromatosis. As you can see, even the color of the liver, it is not like this. It is very dark brown. It is dark brown liver on gross, because on the microscopy also we can see this dark golden brown pigment within the hepatocytes, granular, coarse granular golden brown pigment within the hepatocytes. So this is very classical case of hemochromatosis. Now how to confirm that this is hemosiderin? Now this is very important. So this is a Prussian blue stain. Prussian blue stain is a kind of special stain which confirms that this pigment is hemosiderin. How it uses, basically we have potassium ferricyanide and we treat the sections with dilute HCl. Now potassium ferricyanide combines with the ferric ions. Now there is ferric iron present in the hemosiderin, so it forms ferric ions combined with potassium ferricyanide to form a bluish insoluble product. Can you see these blue granules, coarse blue granules? They are ferric ferrocyanide, which is the end product of the reaction. So this is how potassium ferricyanide combines with ferric irons in the presence of HCl to form a bluish end product, which is ferric ferrocyanide, which is confirmatory for a hemosiderin. And hemochromatosis, the Kupffer cells or the macrophages are spared. Now just a word about bile pigment. As you told, it is bile pigments are basically derived from the bilirubin, from which are the end products of heme degradation, and bile is seen basically in the hepatocytes. Now it is secreted by the hepatocytes. So whenever there is impaired bile flow, so that leads to accumulation of the bile pigment within the hepatocytes. So this can occur whenever there is any extrahepatic or intrahepatic bile obstruction or any defect in the hepatocytic bile secretion. So the bile will basically gets accumulated within the hepatocytes, and it is a very classical greenish brown or golden brown, greenish to golden brown pigment within the hepatocytes. You can see this is intracellular bile pigment. This is known as cholestasis. So accumulation of bile within the hepatocytes is intracellular cholestasis, and this is a bile plug which is seen basically within the canaliculus. So this is accumulation of the bile within the canaliculus. So this is cholestasis, which is seen in obstruction, cases of obstructions. This we have already discussed, the basically degradation of heme by heme oxygenase to form biliverdin, and then it is basically reduced to bilirubin, and here ferric iron is released. So, and how do we confirm that this is a bile? Because this also appears, golden to greenish to golden brown pigment. So the confirmatory stain is Hall stain. Hall stain, what is it contain? It contains Fauchet's reagent. You will be performing these tests, Fauchet's test on urine also. So Fauchet's reagent basically comprises of 10% of ferric chloride. Now that oxidizes the bile pigment to biliverdin, which shows shades of olive to emerald green. So the end product is formation of biliverdin, which is greenish, olive to emerald green. And what is the principle? That ferric chloride, 10% ferric chloride oxidizes the bile pigment to biliverdin, and Fauchet's reagent is the reagent. Now coming on to the last topic, which is I'll just wind up in 5 minutes. So this is calcification. Now pathological calcification is basically deposition of calcium salts in the form of calcium phosphate or carbonate along with small amounts of iron and magnesium within the tissues. Now there are two basic types of calcification, dystrophic and metastatic. Dystrophic calcification occurs basically in the dead or the necrotic tissues. It is important you get a short note on the differences between the two. So dystrophic calcification occurs in the dead or the necrotic tissue when there is no abnormality, derangement in the calcium metabolism, serum calcium levels are normal. In contrast, metastatic calcification always occurs in the normal tissue, and it is almost always associated with hypercalcemia due to some disturbance in the calcium metabolism. So, dystrophic calcification, it occurs in any necrotic focus. So it classically seen in the caseous necrosis of tuberculosis. So whenever there is a tuberculous lymph node with necrosis, there's calcification. In damaged heart walls, in atheromas, I told you there was in atheroma also there was a focus of calcification, and in infarct, in thrombi in the veins, and whenever there's dead parasites like schistosomiasis, whenever there's dead, degenerating or dying tissue, there is calcification. And grossly, how does it appear? As fine white granules, basically white granules or clumps which you feel as gritty, with a gritty on cut. So you can see this photograph. This is an aortic valve, and this is a calcific aortic stenosis. It is markedly, it is stenotic, it is narrow, luminal is narrow, and these are the semilunar cusps. You can see they are very thickened, and you can see this gritty, white, irregular masses, whitish, gritty, irregular masses, which are basically dystrophic calcification because of the damaged and stenotic valve. Now, morphologically, microscopically, a calcification appears as big bluish. So that is why on H&E staining, we use the word basophilic. Basophilic means bluish. Eosinophilic means pink. So this is calcium is basophilic, amorphous. It is, powdery, amorphous, granular in appearance, and it can be intra or extracellular, and it can undergo bone formation with time. Now, this is a very particular type of calcification, which is Samoma body. It is basically a lamellated configuration. It is a lamellated configuration of calcification, which is seen in certain certain tumors, and it is seen in certain papillary tumors. For example, it's classically seen in the papillary thyroid cancer, in which there is a round small nidus of calcification, and then progressively there are further outer layers, lamellated layers of calcification are laid over it. It forms something like onion skinning. So it is a lamellated deposition of calcium, and it is known as Samoma bodies. It is classically seen in papillary thyroid cancer. Now another is, sorry, this is the pigment, the slide, I missed out that slide in the exogenous pigment. I'll take up this later. So this is an example, the classical example of dystrophic calcification is seen in the atherosclerotic vessels. So this is known as Monckeberg sclerosis. You can see this basophilic calcium deposition within the intima of these thick-walled blood vessels, which are atherosclerotic, and seen in aged individuals. So the thick-walled, vessels of this is from the uterus, basically. In uterine vessels, they undergo dystrophic calcification. Now coming on to metastatic calcification, I told you this calcification seen in the normal tissues. They are normal viable tissues, and it is associated with hypercalcemia. Now, hypercalcemia there can be many causes. So one can be there is hyperparathyroidism in these patients. There can be increased levels of PTH either due to PTH tumors or ectopic secretion of PTH related proteins. Or there can be active resorption of bone tissue, or active bone tissue resorption is seen in tumors like multiple myeloma, or in whenever there are diffuse skeletal metastasis, or whenever there is accelerated bone turnover. So that basically leads to increased bone turnover, leads to hypercalcemia like Paget's disease and all. Or there can be vitamin D related disorders like vitamin D intoxication and sarcoidosis, in which the macrophages basically they activate vitamin D precursor. So there is increased sensitivity to vitamin D, which leads to increased hypercalcemia. And the last is renal failure. Renal failure can cause retention of phosphate. So there is hyperphosphatemia, which leads to secondary hyperparathyroidism. It is not primary hyperparathyroidism. It is hyperphosphatemia. Retention of phosphate leads to secondary hyperparathyroidism. So all these conditions basically leads to hypercalcemia, which leads to deposition of calcium salts within the normal tissues. So classically it is seen in the gastric mucosa, kidneys, lungs, systemic arteries, and cornea. So these are the tissues basically which secrete acid. So they have an internal alkaline compartment because they excrete acid. So they have an internal alkaline compartment which predisposes them to metastatic calcification. Now it can be either amorphous deposit or it can be hydroxyapatite crystals. Now classical example is nephrocalcinosis, in which there is deposition of these calcium crystals within the basement membrane of the tubules, of the proximal tubules, and also within the lumina. So here we can see the calcium deposits within the lumina of the tubules and along the basement membrane of the tubules. So this is my last slide. This is basically just to show you the differences between dystrophic and metastatic calcification. I've already told you it occurs in dead and degenerated tissues. This is normal tissues. There is calcium metabolism and serum calcium level are normal, where both are deranged in metastatic calcification. Dystrophic is usually irreversible, and this metastatic is reversible if there is correction of the metabolic disorder. And situations, the causes I have told you, it can occur in necrosis, scars, aderomas, tumors, and all. And these situations I have told you. So this is the basic difference. This was my last slide, and I just missed out one slide, just 1 minute. So another exogenous important pigment apart from coal dust was asbestos. It also, the exposure occurs in the persons who are working in the asbestos factories. So it is basically a environmental occupational hazard. So these asbestos crystals are also very highly irritative, and they induced massive fibrogenic response. So they are deposited within it is again inhaled through the upper respiratory tract, and basically the pigment, the asbestos, forms basically ferruginous bodies which are deposited in the lung parenchyma. What are these ferruginous bodies? They are nothing but accumulation of calcium and iron salts around this long, slender spicules of asbestos. Basically, there is a needle type asbestos crystals around which calcium and iron salts are deposited, and it forms a very beaded kind of dumbbell forms. You can see this beaded kind of dumbbell forms which are known as ferruginous bodies, and which is the stain I just showed you. This is again the basically iron stain, Prussian blue stain. That is why they are known as ferruginous bodies, because these bodies are beautifully visible on Prussian blue stain because they have iron. So they are beautifully stained on Prussian blue stain, and that is why they are known as ferruginous bodies, and they are composed of asbestos along with iron and calcium salts. So this finishes my lecture. Now, any questions, if anyone has any doubts, I'm happy to take. So there are no more questions? No questions? Does anyone has any query, any question? Are there any questions? Okay. Someone has asked what is foci of injury. Foci means focus. You want to know what is the meaning of focus? Focus means one spot of injury. Focus means a single focus. Like in a whole section, there is one point. There is a focal of injury. Means there is one focus which is showing injury. So that is focus. So any other, if there are no questions, then I think I'll log out. And okay, someone has asked another question. Why does glycogen accumulate in PCT in diabetes mellitus, considering that decreased insulin stimulates glycogenolysis? Okay, so that is a very good question. So see, that is the basic mechanism, that there is decreased insulin, it stimulates glycogenolysis, but it is also seen that in some in diabetes, so there is an entity called hepatic glycogen hepatopathy, in which due to certain there is due to derangement in the metabolism, see there is excessive amount of glucose which is outside the cell, right? And the cells are not able to use it. So when the levels of glucose are so high that there is passive uptake of the glucose by these cells like hepatocytes and by these PCT cells, and those glucose, then when there is excessive glucose which has come into the cell, then that is deposited in the form of glycogen. So that is basically a very recently coming concept that that leads to basically glycogen hepatopathy. So and the implication of this is that it is seen in patients who have uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. So when there is so much of excessive hyperglycemia, that leads to glycogen formation and deposition within the cells. That is not related to basically insulin. That is insulin independent pathway. So then that when there is excessive glucose, then that basically is converted into glycogen, and that can cause damage to the hepatocytes and renal tubular cells. In fact, the liver biopsy is done in uncontrolled diabetes mellitus to see whether at times that what is the cause of deranged liver function tests. So the implication is that if we found glycogen in patients of uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, that is a reversible thing. So those patients need to go on strict this control, drug control. So they need to upgrade the doses of insulin and all. So basically that shows what is your control of glucose levels over the past few days. So that is a newer concept which is coming up. So I hope I'm clear. So okay, then we have already overshoot the time by 15 minutes. So okay, then I'll end the lecture. Okay, thank you everyone.